We're going to go ahead and get started here with our work session. We have a very compact agenda, 3 items, matter of business, and this is a work session on the budget. So I'll entertain a motion to adopt the agenda as presented.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
First item is discussion of draft fund balance. But before that, I just want to make one comment. I'm very proud that this board is actually engaging in the budget process this early. I encourage all of us to be very open and transparent about it. We do not have any gaps. The first year I sat as a commissioner, we had a $143 million gap in April. That's the nature of the beast as you sit and work budgets. You get everything out on the table. We have a thoughtful dialogue and discussion about it, and then we get to a final budget as presented by the town manager, which will be balanced. So I know there's been some noise out on Facebook about gaps and concerns about gaps, et cetera. You know, my take on that is we will do our job and be very transparent and let the pundits talk about it out there. But with that, I am going to turn it over to Lisa White.
Well, one of the most important things that we need to do when we're planning the budget is make sure that we have the funding available. And the largest thing that we're planning is hopefully our CIP. And in order to do that, we need to make sure we know where our funding is, how much funding we have, what can we spend. So before we go any further in the budget process, we need to address our financial policies. The most important is the fund balance policy. A lot of the rating agencies, when we're going to go out and get debt for all the projects that we want to do, they're going to want to make sure that we have strong financial policies and that our finances are in line with our policies. So we took a look at the policy that we had before, and we went out and we drafted a new policy for your consideration. It's a little more detailed than the last one was. It explains what the different components of fund balance are, and fund balance is defined by the GASB, Government Accounting Standards Board, and in 2009 they redid how that looks, and there's 5 different buckets that fund balance can be classified as, and I think we talked at the retreat about the restricted fund balances and the assigned fund balances and the committed fund balances. And those are all things like the TAP grant that should have been assigned to the TAP grant. So when you look at the general fund and our financial statements, all those different things were committed or assigned or restricted. The state also places, in North Carolina, they call it reserve for state statute. And it's a long formula of what they require you to set aside. So after all that's done, then you have what's called unassigned, and basically that's what people used to call available. That means you have it available to appropriate in next year's budget. So then you have to decide how much of that available do you want to appropriate, or how much are you going to set aside for financial stability, emergencies, and all those sorts of things. And so you start looking at how you compare with some of the other towns. Every town is different, depends on the size, depends on where it is. If you live on the coast, you might want to have more fund balance because you might get wiped away by a hurricane. And it depends on what you plan on doing with that fund balance. So what we did was we looked at several different towns, and ranges are used a lot. Range gives you the flexibility that if you had just a minimum that was set, then you'd always be having to make remedial steps if you slipped slightly below that median. So what we did was look at several towns our size, and we're recommending that we look at considering between 30 and 40%. Right now, as of last fiscal year, we're sitting at 34% unassigned fund balance. So that would be right in that range and give us a little bit of flexibility. The policy also says that anything over the 40%, if we end up growing, then we'll set that aside in a capital reserve fund so that we can know kind of how much we have for projects. And it also, one of the other important things that Davenport mentioned to us is that we need to address in our policy, what do we do if we fall below the minimum? So we have to make some remedial steps. If we end up spending more, then we need to come back together. Town manager needs to bring to you a recommendation of how to fix the situation. So I think I've explained it. Do you have anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, this really just is the first step that we can do prior to the budget. There's some other steps that we're going to come back to you with regarding investment policy, some other policies that would fall under financial policies, but they're really not needed prior to budget. We've got the fall to do that and really take the time to look at what those might be, what's allowed by state law, and then what those options might be for investments. But there will be additional policies that will come back after the budget's adopted and proposed that we look at prior to the issuance of debt.
How did you come up with the 36 months to restore if we go under the 30%? Is that pretty much a standard?
That was, we saw that in several of the different policies that I found.
Okay, thank you.
And from a practical standpoint, if you think about how that plays out, is you finish the fiscal year in June 30. Your financials and the audit aren't really presented until November, December timeframe. We would know ahead of time where we stand, but that then gives the board some time and the manager to plan for not just the cycle that you finished, the cycle you're in, and then really the coming budget cycle. So it's not something that you could actually remedy in 6 months or a year. You're going to need a couple budget cycles to come up with a plan to get back to where you need to be.
Okay. Comments, questions? Do we want to provide direction? My personal opinion is this has been a journey. 3-4 years ago, we had no real stated policy. We started at 50%. Now we have some experience and contacts from other towns that tell us, you know, continue to refine it. I love the fact that we have an action plan that we have to take if we fall below an amount, because that truly is one of the things that was lacking in the original policy. So personal opinion is I think this is a good policy going forward. Any other thoughts?
I agree, and I appreciate everything that you've done to bring a lot of this together, because in the last 2 years it's kind of been here and there, but things make a lot more sense since you've been here.
Thank you, good.
I'll concur with what you've said, and Brenda. I mean, it's like, whew, finally, you know, there's a way forward.
So finally would be that you bring it forward so we actually adopt it at the next board meeting, right?
Yeah.
That's true. There you go.
We plan to have it on there.
Okay.
Okay.
And is everybody okay if we just put it on the consent agenda from that standpoint, or do you feel?
I mean, unless there's a need for a presentation, we can do either way, but absolutely can put it on the consent.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Ferguson, Waxhaw Volunteer Fire Department.
I think you have in front of you a handout that details the fire department requests for this year. If you recall, last year during the budget process, the board directed at that time for the fire department and the economic development organization to really be removed from the external appropriation process and reside separately in the budget. So we did that. So this year, the request from the fire department, last year, just to refresh your memory, the fire department asked for a piece of equipment that they have purchased, which is a UTV or a four-wheel drive type vehicle that you can transport a patient on, or equipment or whatever in a confined space, whether it be downtown during an event or a greenway or a trail. They have more flexibility to operate, so they have that and it's operational. This year the request is two-part, the largest part being a piece of equipment that allows the department to refill their air packs on site versus having to shuttle to another station. I believe it's in Wesley Chapel, where they have a full compressor fill the air packs and then shuttle back, so you've got trucks and people away from the station. The total cost of a compressor, which is a piece of equipment that's about the size of 3 or 4 refrigerators, it's a pretty big piece of equipment, but it's really a $51,000 plus piece of equipment. It would reside in Station 18. So what they have proposed is that the town's portion is essentially one half of that, and then they've asked the county for the other half of the cost. So essentially, if you take 27,500 times 2 is the total cost of the piece of equipment. So that makes up the largest portion of the fire department requests. The secondary and smaller portion, about 10% more, is they have put dollar figures and hours to the special events staffing that they provide through the year. And this is probably not all encompassing, so there's some other events that probably get hours as well. But these are the big events that take up the most time and effort, and in some cases they're not necessarily getting volunteers to cover the station and the event, so there is some compensation being provided there. So that's about $2,500, and they've detailed out what those events are, and then the number of EMTs or firefighters that are provided or needed for the event. If there are other events that are non-town related, then those event organizers are going to have to pay for those resources separately, so those aren't going to be reflected here. So if there's a special event like the one a couple weeks back and it requires EMTs or on-site people, that'd be a separate agreement. But this, in essence, is what you'll see as far as the request that's reflected in the budget for this year. I've met with the fire chief and talked about where they are with the county process. As you know, they're in the midst of a fire study. The last information we have is there's probably not going to be any results or information that's going to come out of that process, certainly before the budgets have to be adopted for the town and the county, and it may well be into the next fiscal year, quite a ways before we hear anything that comes out of that would inform maybe the next year's budget process or 2 years down the road. But that really is not going to have any bearing on how we fund fire, or really how the county funds fire. So the fire department made a number of requests to the county for equipment, land for future stations, people. So there's a lot of requests made at the county level that we're not seeing here, because the town piece is kind of a smaller piece, because the funding, as you know, goes directly to the county. So the fire tax is generated and goes directly to the county, and so they're in the position right now of getting the largest part of the requests. These relate to the town more specifically, and certainly the events.
So last year, I believe the ATV, UTV, whatever it is, wasn't that around $23,000?
About 24.
And 24, okay, so that we're in the same ballpark. And we've never been able to do cost accounting on the events in the past. We've never really done that. So now we're at that next step of discipline, that's what's calling this out, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah, I think the other realization is that as some of the events grow, they are requiring more resources, and so the fire department's certainly cognizant of what those needs are. When you have 1,000 people or 2,000 people, there's some standards as to how many personnel you need to be staffed up for. So those things are coming into play as some of the events are quite large, and so we want to make sure that there are adequate resources here, and they've done a good job of that, but it's just with a cost.
Comments, questions?
Yeah, I mean, I can see with the completion of the mill, the new apartments coming online, and, just housing in general, but those two projects, particularly because of their density, the piece of equipment, I think, is well worth the expense. If you have a fire in an apartment project, it can be rather intense.
Well, and that's a good point, is that if you did have a fire that was multi-hour in nature in a bigger structure and multiple teams went in with air packs, as it would be advantageous to fill them
Right there
close
on
by
the site.
versus 7 or 8 miles up the road.
Commissioner Westlake, did you have a question?
So has a request been made to Ginger Snap to take care of that portion, that, for their event? I just see that line on the bottom.
Yeah, I think there has been some discussion with staff as to probably pulling that one out. So we may have, it may decrease that one by $330,
Right.
but that, yes, that has been raised.
And then, so for the compressor, now, would other stations be able to come over and use this, do you know, or does everybody have their own at this point?
No, not, other stations would have the ability to come use it, and really that's almost a mutual aid type response. We're not gonna deny a station from filling an air pack there, but it's not gonna be convenient for them. As I understand, I think right now we're the beneficiary of being able to use the equipment that's at Wesley Chapel. So certainly other departments would have that same, and frankly, as the county pays for half of it, it's a
Right.
county asset, like it would be a town asset, so they would share that.
And the reality is, depending upon the call structure and what's going on at that point in time, Wesley Chapel could be the first one to respond and Waxhaw if our guys are out.
Well, and we actually have a portion of Waxhaw that's in the primary response zone for Wesley Chapel.
Any other questions?
Okay. That details that public safety aspect. Moving on to the other handout you have, which is the special appropriation request. They're external agencies.
Well, first, did you want to address anything about the service agreement with the Museum of the Waxhaw, or are you handling that in the informational meetings?
Sure. No, we did mention that in informational meetings. We have met, Dina and myself, with the Museum of the Waxhaws and had some constructive dialogue about kind of where we're at in that evolution as to their consideration of whether they'd be willing to do a couple things. One is provide access through the property for the trail, Carolina Thread Trail. They seem to be open to that possibility and really just wanted to get the Thread Trail staff here to talk about the details and how that would work, signage, but is an openness and willingness to consider that. Secondarily, and more directly related to the town, was a dialogue and discussion about programming in the building and on the property. And so we had some exploratory discussions on, how much usage in a best case scenario and maybe a limited scenario that the town might have. And when I use the term best case, it's if we were able to get to a point where we're programming a lot of activities and events, probably the maximum that there would be a need for a facility, whether it's that one or another facility, would be maybe a weekly program for a certain age group and activity group, and then maybe a monthly activity for another age group that might be senior related. So maximum programming at some point down the road, whether it's that facility or another facility, might be one event a week for one age group and one event per month for other age groups. So 50 to 62 events a year maximum on the very high end of the scale. The reality is that we're probably looking at something very much scaled back from that as we start looking at what programming needs there are in the community. As you're aware, we've begun to do some programming for seniors. We have senior coffees that are kind of going on and have been well received. We've had the exhibit at the McDonald House of the Lucy show memorabilia. Those things were enjoyed and well received, but we don't have a staff position that's dedicated to doing that. So that's really a limiting factor, something that the Parks Department is looking at. Is that something that we look at for the future? This year we have the budget, as you know, is got a lot of competing interest. We shared all that with the museum folks and simply said, we appreciate the openness and willingness to have the dialogue. The reality is we may or may not have a need. So an ongoing conversation. They did express interest in getting a partnership back in place. They expressed interest in the town providing a service that we have for a number of years in some mowing capacity on the property. constructive dialogue, nothing that was decided, just simply continuation of a conversation. We did indicate certainly that the budget process dictates what and how and what needs the town might have and activities that we might want to pursue. The next step, we're expecting to get some information from the museum board as to if they're interested in events on the property, what size events could they think they could accommodate, and at that point we'll have some evaluation of whether that fits any of the needs that the town might have in the future. Currently, there are no activities or plans or events that we have on the property, and there's really no joint programming occurring currently. There's also no maintenance of the property or mowing of the property that's going on right now by town staff. So the current situation is we're not in a contractual relationship of any sort. So positive conversation, but we don't really have anything to report out to you other than that's the current status.
And they made no request for nonprofit funding this year?
They did not submit. There was some discussion during the dialogue about, you know, what that might be if they submitted a request, but they did not submit one during that process.
Questions for the manager? Very good. Item 4, special appropriations, nonprofit organizations.
Last October, the board, after the completion of the budget process last year, requested staff to come back and make a recommendation as to maybe a refinement, I would call it, of the external appropriation process and policies for nonprofit organizations. Last year, we had, if I recall correctly, over $60,000 worth of requests from the organizations that you see listed on the page here. The board did not and could not fund all $60,000 as requested, and so there was a smaller amount approved, which I believe was around 65% of the request at that time, but it was really based 65% of the request and not a limited amount of funding. The policy that the town adopted in October actually limited the total for nonprofit external agencies to $10,000 in total, and gave a maximum of $2,000 per agency or organization. So this year, the organizations that are listed on the sheet, you can see that there are some that did not submit. We have 2 that did not submit that received funding last year, and then we have 6 that did submit, and we have not exercised any kind of value judgment as to the appropriateness of whether one organization receives $1,000 or $2,000. The spreadsheet simply says if you divvied up the $10,000 funding 6 ways, you'd look at about $1,680 per agency, if that's the funding philosophy that we utilize. If there are other approaches, then we're certainly can talk about that tonight. But as new staff, certainly last year, I was not in a position to do anything other than some simple math, which is you can divide it up and make percentages, and that's what we ended up, I believe, approving last year. This pretty much approaches it the same way. There are varying degrees, certainly, of how these organizations serve our residents, whether they are in schools or whether they're not in schools, but some of these organizations may have more of a county focus. So we've really not tried to, you're probably in a better position in your tenure and being residents here for a longer time to understand your sense of what the various organizations provide. So we've simply done it the way that's fair from a mathematical standpoint, which is divided by 6. We'll look for feedback from you, but this is the approach that we've taken to date, just based on the total limit to the funding. Those, I think that you've gotten the detail that's in the packets that was submitted, so 70 some odd pages of detail you have available.
questions, comments, thoughts?
Just a couple comments. One is, when I reread the policy, that I felt comfortable with it, and quite frankly, I feel comfortable with what you've presented here. You know, it's something that's done across the country, but I think what was happening to us was just increasing, and there was no control put on it. I think this is more than adequate. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I think I mean, dividing the money equally is probably the fairest way to do it, but I'm not convinced that we should be giving money at all. I mean, we're taking in someone's tax dollars that they could be deciding which charities they want to support and claiming their tax write-offs so that we can support the charities that happen to ask us or that we choose. I have charities that I like to support, that my family supports, and we make those decisions. How much can we afford in a given year, and who do we want to give that money to? And we're taking that choice away from people by pulling in their tax money to give to specific charities. So I'm not convinced that this is a policy we need to continue. Not that there's anything wrong with these charities. They're wonderful. I've never met a charity yet that didn't pull at my heartstrings and make me want to open my wallet. But budgets are budgets. Just my 2 cents.
Other comments?
Is there a precedent or something that states why towns are distributing funds to charities? Are there other towns that do this? And if so, you know, can you explain that?
Yeah, this philosophical discussion is taking place all over the state at this time of year, and it's not unique to Charlotte region or any place else. Absolutely, the concern by some happens to be if a resident wants to donate directly to an organization, they should be able to. So it's really going to come down to a philosophical decision as far as what the board wants to do. The policy as it was drafted was based on requests from the previous board to give some limits to what was going to be requested, and then a little bit more process. So there's a little bit a different process now. What was happening before it was fairly complex and burdensome requirements for even applying, and then you may or might not see any funding. But this is not unique. Some communities have moved to do exactly what we're at right now, which is provide a hard limit as to what the dollar amount is, and they've gotten there based on a percentage or what felt right as part of the total budget. Other communities have said we're going to either do away or phase out with external appropriations over time, and they gave external agencies a 1-year, 2-year, multi-year deadline to say, if you're using this money for operational expenses, you don't need to, number one, and number two, if you are, we're giving you fair warning that it's going to go away at some point. So that's happened in other towns around the area. There are some communities that take a different approach, and there's no limit. So they have a pretty wide open policy, and their approach is anybody should be able to ask.
So this is a case by case, a county by county,
Town by town.
town by town situation as to whether or not. So is this something that Waxhaw had any, I mean, how did they really get started with doing this? Is there a history or reasoning behind why we are funding a number of agencies, or what agencies?
There's a long history here. This is pennies on the dollar compared to where it was. I mean,
I'm just asking this for clarification.
My first year was somewhere in the neighborhood of $87,000, I think, and we were actually contributing to the operating budgets of 3 or 4 organizations. And so we've started the process with Manager Ferguson's help to bring it back down.
And slimming.
Keep slimming it. What you have here, as I recall, and I don't see Chief Ice here, but last year when we went through this, we were asking departments, how are you using these organizations? And I know, like for instance, the Humane Society, our animal control works hand in hand with them, and so felt that was justified in terms of where we were at that point in time. This turning point as well. I know they use that in a different sense, but the police use that. Dina, and on her programming, Artist Music Guild, can you justify, are you programming for the town, or are you programming for the schools in the town? And Artist Music Guild and the Union County Community Arts Council fell into that category. The Waxhaw Arts Council is the Waxhaw Arts Council. And that's how we got to a much, much smaller list. If it's time to continue moving forward, then that's certainly something we should consider. I do think, to Manager Ferguson's point, we should probably alert people and give them the year's notice to do that. And you're right, I think last year was in the $65,000, $70,000 range, and we got aggressive and went down to 10 by design. So, but it goes. I mean, we used to have 20. We'd have a whole session of, gosh, 2.5 hours long, where people would come make their presentation, and 15 to 20 of them. I mean,
I think for me, the criteria was if the organization actually provided a service
to Waxhaw.
to Waxhaw, to the citizens of Waxhaw, that was important. There were some, that were taking money from the town and regifting it. And that was where we just said, wait, this is sort of nuts.
We're not going to fund somebody else's scholarships.
Right.
I mean, that's so, and that was work we had to do to get it cleaned up. So this is part of the journey.
Do all of these work in Waxhaw as far as the Waxhaw benefits from all of these here?
I think they all would represent that they do. I don't know that we have a way to check that.
So is that included in our packet? Okay, because I haven't gone through all of that yet, but I will. And also, I know that we're scaling down from what you said, 87.5 last year to 10,000 now, and it's been coming down over the years. But as far as the residents, that quite a few in emails on the last 2 years, particularly last year, had a real problem with continuing this program. So what you were talking about, Mayor Maher, I've given them a year's notice if we do decide to not do this anymore. I don't understand that, because they're applying for something that they should not be planning on getting. So.
Well, they're applying to a program that we put out there.
Right.
And so
but
let's
it's not
declare
a sure
that the
thing.
program, it's not a sure
Because
thing.
if they're budgeting this money based on, well, I am going to get it, then they might be wrong.
Well, no, absolutely, and a lot of them found that out last year and the year before. I just think in my opinion, and it could be only my opinion, I think if we're going to eliminate it, to give them notice, and be done with it.
If I could say something, I'm not necessarily against providing additional funding for organizations that help more social issues, such as you mentioned, Turning Point, things that have partnered with the police department, but other ones maybe are more related to personal interest, such as arts and music, and I'm wondering if that's really the role of government, to be funding those types of organizations. And so as I see this as being a fair way to distribute what we allow in our policy, I'm wondering if do we need to do that? Do we need to just automatically give this to all of the ones that have applied, or can we be selective? There doesn't seem to be anything really in the policy regarding that.
Well, the direction that was given last year was the benefit you bring to Waxhaw. And so the justification was, do you bring benefit to Waxhaw? to me, the simplest thing is, after this year, do away with it, because otherwise, everything is subjective. I mean.
Right, I mean,
and
I may not
just do away with it and be done with it.
be interested in one thing, but may be interested in another, so, and that is, each person's gonna have their own opinion on what's important, I suppose. Yeah, no, there's a few there that I feel do provide a good social benefit, such as the Turning Point and Humane Society, but I don't know if so is this consensus that everyone is, besides me, is saying that we should do away with the policy completely, or?
Now, are you doing away with the policy immediately, or are you going to give them notice? I think that these people applied based upon maybe the history of Waxhaw and the information that was out there, which is why this is here now. Are you going to then do away with everything? Are you picking and choosing because you've mentioned the Humane Society and Turning Point and only picking two? Are you now, I mean, it's a combination question here. Are you reducing the funds based upon the 10,000 to the two to divide it between that amount, or the amount that's listed? So how are you proposing to do away with this, and what
Well,
do you?
we couldn't change the policy at this point. I mean, we've already told them that they could only apply for up to 2,000, but if we're allowing 10,000, is there a possibility of changing the policy to being maybe not a limit per organization? I mean, we could limit, say, $10,000, but maybe we would give more than 2,000 to one, and
How do you
You could
pick
give
and?
10,000 to one.
Can I?
Then,
Yeah.
No, I don't mean to interrupt.
Yeah.
No, sorry.
Go ahead.
If we do that, though, we're starting to make a value judgment.
Right,
That's
Right,
what
but
it-
no, that's-
everything's subjective. I might say arts are very important because keep a kid in an art program, he's not out on the street causing trouble.
That was gonna-
You might say arts aren't as important as Humane Society and something else. So I think we should either be equitable across all or do away with it.
And I would.
And I would say, yes, giving them a year is great, it's nice, but I think it's over and beyond what we need to do, because this was an application. An application is not a guarantee. It doesn't mean you're entitled to this money. It doesn't mean you were automatically going to get any money. And I personally I heard a lot about this from citizens during the campaigns and recently, by people who were shocked to find that we do this. And philosophically, I just think we should stay out of it.
well, if we're talking about doing away with the policy, like I said, there's a few here that I feel have social needs, and I would hate to just not give them anything this year. I would rather do the 1 year notice if that's the way the board wants to do. So then I guess the most fair way is to be equitable among all that have applied, like you've said.
All or none, yeah.
But I would hate to take that away
I
from.
don't think we have a consensus on anything yet,
Well,
but
no,
we're
no,
all
so
thinking,
let-
we're all talking.
Let's
Yeah,
discussion,
so
yeah.
this is good discussion. So
Yeah.
it truly is. I think I'm a big believer in town accountability, and if we if we wanted to change this policy, we shouldn't have sent a letter out on 12/18 to them and say,
Right.
hey, would you fill out an application? I mean, I'm not saying that that's anybody's fault other than us for not getting on top of the policy early enough. So philosophically, I agree with you, Commissioner Lee, that, you know, it's, the time's come, we have so many needs. We need to put our taxpayers first. And I just think a year transition, complete the process that got started last year is in my mind fair and equitable for all, but I understand what you're saying too, so I respect what you're saying.
I have a question, and it may just be something that I didn't pay attention to as far as the last policy. Did we have it in the policy where we would send a letter out asking them to fill this out? Okay,
So we would alert them.
forgot about that.
Yeah, we would alert them, and then we would follow up with them, and in fact, I think the clerk's office did badger them if they didn't turn something in. Are you sure you don't want to? And I don't mean that other than in a very positive way. You kept on top of them to say, hey, you haven't said anything in.
Can I ask, does the policy as it stands now, because I don't see the actual writing, and maybe I'm missing it, does it say that it limits the total allocation to $10,000, or that there will be $10,000 allocated? Because if it only says it limits it, We could split the difference and say we'll give everybody half of this year, and next year we're done.
I think it says limits, doesn't it? Yeah. We're not gonna spend any more than $10,000.
Yes, but
That's the way it's written.
if it says, if we don't have to spend the full 10,000, we could come down from that and then say, this is our phasing out. We're gonna give you an even smaller portion. We're gonna give you something next year. You're on your own.
But
So the step we took, just to be clear, we went from 85,000 to
To 10.
some percentage of the 85,000, that got it down to 65,000, 65%.
But we first removed the fire department and the EDC.
Correct. That's right.
Then removed the museum and the women's club and set those aside to try to achieve agreements.
Right.
And then the balance of that was funded at 65% per request.
I've got
And
the
then got it
policy
down
up if
to
you want me just to read what it says.
What-
Yeah,
Could you read it out loud?
yeah. The
Well,
total amount of funding available for award to all nonprofit organizations shall not exceed $10,000 for any fiscal year, with no more than $2,000 awarded to any single nonprofit organization.
Thank you.
So then you can cut it in half.
Just says shall not exceed.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. That makes you can limit that.
If you would please come up so they can catch it on the microphone.
Also, in the letters that we just sent as a courtesy, because it had been done in previous years to those who had been funded, it noted, and those letters are included in your locked portion, it states that the board might not allocate any money for this purpose, so.
Okay.
So they were given warning.
Right. So, and that it would be totally up to the board during budget time, how much is awarded, and that possibly nothing could be awarded, just so you're all aware.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struggling with a couple of these only because I do think about things like Turning Point, who do help Waxhaw citizens.
Before you look at them individually, are you for moving away from the policy and just eliminating it over, whether it's this year or next year, are you for getting out of this approach? Just the policy at this point, not the individuals that have applied.
Just the concept of charities.
I am.
Where is everybody on that?
I'm
Consensus
for
for?
Moving
Moving
away
away?
from it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't like the fact that people have to beg for money. I think that's kind of wrong. I think with the steps that we took at your suggestion, to take the fire department out of it, to make the women's club a separate issue, to make the museum a separate
Service
issue,
agreements.
we're good. Is there more room in there for something like that? I don't know, but I don't like the idea that people have to ask for money and then wait several months and so forth and so on.
Well, and some of these, I know do fundraisers. Because I've given to them before
Sure.
on the outside, and some of them don't. So you're coming with that
Yeah.
aspect as well.
So policy-wise, I sense consensus that we want to get to a position where we eliminate the not-for-profit or nonprofit funding approach.
But I'd like to keep open, if we do have something like Turning Point, do we want to consider them separately? If they are really providing a service to the town, do we want to?
But that's still a charitable,
That's a-
nonprofit.
What
funded
about some type
organization.
of partnership, though, like through our
That's
police
still-
department,
Yeah.
for both Turning Point and Humane Society because of.
So
the
my
animal
suggestion would
control?
be the police department
The
ought to
police
handle that in
department.
their budget and bring
Right.
it forward.
The police
I
department
mean,
would have to do that.
if they feel they need that, just like if Lisa felt like she needed some CFO consulting, whatever, that would be part of her
Part of their
budget, right?
Budget.
Not
I mean-
part of ours.
And handle it that way. That's where I think, that's in concept, the service agreement that we really got to. If you look at
Right.
what's happening, the service agreement for the Women's Club is handled through Kurt. The service agreement through the Museum of the Waxhaw would be handled through the Department, Parks and Rec Department, which
And
makes,
then those department budgets will come before
Yeah.
us, and it will be part of the whole budget that we
Yeah.
discuss and approve or
Then it's-
disapprove or change.
tied to it.
Well, okay, so I do agree with y'all on it being charities. I agree. I see your position on that. I do hope that we can, through the police department or however, that we can assist some of these through fundraising or whatever, that, because they are helping our Waxhaw citizens.
They directly help Waxhaw citizens.
Question.
I don't think you're gonna have any trouble with the police department doing work with the Humane Society. I mean, as a good, as an
Turning
example.
point, I think about the women
Yeah.
too, so.
That might be something they do more quietly, for obvious reasons, too. So, we have consensus that within a year, we put a timeline around, but within a year, we want to move away from, okay, so that's good. You had a comment?
No, that was going to be my question. Are we doing that within a certain time frame? So when we say within a year, so then this is the last,
Well, I wanted to get to within a year first, so that's where we are. So
Step
now,
one.
what does everybody think? Do you want to fund this year? What's the consensus on that? So,
are we funding it as it is stated, or are we funding it differently?
Those are all
well,
options right now.
well, first of all, do we want to fund it at all this year?
Okay.
I'm just logically working our way through it. Do we want to fund it at all this year? What's your consensus?
Since we put it out there, I think we should follow through on it.
Commissioner Westlake?
I agree.
Okay, Commissioner Lee?
I'd prefer not to, but I'll settle for half.
Okay, Commissioner
Well,
Byrne?
since we did put it out there and we've sent letters out, I forgot about that. Yes, but, at a reduced rate.
Pro Tem?
Yes, at a reduced rate.
Okay, so we will get rid of the policy in a year. We will fund it this year. Now, what's the reduced rate? What's the maximum we want to, and do we want to evenly distribute it, whatever that total amount is?
5, 6.
Well, there's
Let's do it.
$6,000, $6,000, $1,000 apiece for the six
How's everybody?
I
suggestion.
like that.
I was going to say 500. Okay.
She was gonna say 500.
So we'll start with 1,000. I feel like
You are an
Here, here.
auctioneer.
Who had the sound?
Sold at 1,000.
So we had a suggestion on the table for 1,000 each for 6,000.
I'm good with that.
All right, I'll go with that.
Commissioner Burke?
I'm fine with sticking with the original policy
I'm-
at this point.
I'm with the original myself.
So we have,
I go with 1,000.
so we got 3, 2 to 1,000. So go to 1,000, okay? So 6,000. So is staff clear as to what we want on the 3 pieces? Okay, very good.
What I would suggest is that we just put on the consent agenda at some point to repeal that policy, just so it's not out there.
Okay. Do we need?
I don't know that we need to do it before the budget process, because that may confuse some people, but probably after the budget process, just a consent agenda item to remove it.
And when we approve the budget and we approve the amount, make sure we put that in the letter to them?
Absolutely.
That
Yeah,
this is the
it'll
last year.
clearly say that this is the last year.
Okay, very good. All right, anything else? If not, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.